For years, Diane Downs seemed to have a wonderful life. She was married to her high school sweetheart, worked part-time at a local thrift store, and had 3 children, Christy Ann, Cheryl Lynn, and Stephen Daniel. But that idyllic image shattered in the early 1980s. In 1980, her husband, Stephen Downs, divorced her after he became convinced that young Danny wasn't his son. Downs tried to become a surrogate but failed when the psychiatric tests indicated signs of psychosis. She found brief solace in a new lover until he left her because of her children. So Downs decided to murder them so she could be with him. On May 19, 1983, Diane Downs pulled over to the side of a rural road in Springfield, Oregon, and shot them multiple times with a .22 caliber pistol. She then fired a round into her own arm before driving to the hospital to claim that a bushy-haired stranger had assaulted her family during a terrifying carjacking. With 7-year-old Cheryl dead, 3-year-old Danny paralyzed from the waist down at 3 years of age, and 8-year-old Christy suffering a stroke that impaired her speech, authorities initially believed Downs. That is, until Christy recovered and told them who really shot her. Born on August 7, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona, Elizabeth Diane Downs appeared to have a normal childhood. Behind closed doors, however, she was being molested by her father, Wesley Linden, as early as the age of 12, while he and her mother, Willa Dean, portrayed themselves as upstanding conservatives. As a freshman at Moon Valley High School, Downs dressed like a grown woman of the 1960s and dated older boys. One of them was Stephen Downs, from whom she became inseparable as the pair roved the streets of Phoenix looking for fun. The two would graduate together but briefly part, as Diane Downs enrolled at Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College in Orange, California, and Steve enlisted in the U.S. Navy. But Downs would ultimately be expelled after a year for promiscuous behavior. Reunited in Arizona, the two got married on November 13, 1973. Almost immediately, however, their relationship began to suffer privately. The couple regularly argued about financial issues and fought over alleged infidelities. It was into this environment that Christy, Cheryl Lynn, and Stephen Daniel were born in 1974, 1976, and 1979, respectively. By the time Danny was born, arguments over infidelities had become so intense that Steve became convinced that Danny wasn't his biological son at all, but the product of an affair. Incapable of reconciling, the couple divorced in 1980. The 25-year-old divorcee tried hard to become a surrogate, but failed her psychiatric tests twice. Diane Downs became increasingly negligent of her kids. She often left them with her parents or ex-husband without much notice, seemingly indifferent, and more interested in the affection of other men. Her children were often seen unkempt and appeared malnourished. Downs would routinely leave Christy in charge of her other 2 kids when the girl was only 6 years old. In 1981, however, she met Robert Nick Knickerbocker and embarked on an affair that waved her troubles away. For Knickerbocker, who was married, Diane Downs' children were the equivalent of too many strings attached. He told Downs he had no interest in being a daddy and ended the affair. Within 2 years, she would attempt to murder her kids in the hopeful pursuit of regaining his affection. In April 1983, Diane Downs moved to Springfield, Oregon, and got a job as a postal worker. Then, on May 19, 1983, she drove her children down Old Mohawk Road, just outside of town, pulled over to the side of the road, and shot each of her kids with a .22 caliber pistol. After shooting herself in the left forearm, Diane Downs drove to the hospital at a snail's pace. A driver told police it couldn't have been more than about 5 miles per hour. Dr. Stephen Wilhite had just gotten home when his beeper went off. He rushed back for the emergency and recalled thinking Christy was dead. He saved her life and updated Downs to suspicious results. Downs lied and said she didn't own a gun. but a search warrant revealed otherwise. Police also found her diary, which was filled with references to Knickerbocker and his hesitancy about the relationship. The witness who saw her drive slowly after the shooting only furthered suspicions. She was arrested on February 28, 1984, and when Christie regained her speech, the facts were clear. When asked who shot her, the girl replied simply, "My mom." Diane Downs had tried to murder her own kids and driven slowly to the hospital in hopes they would bleed out. And in 1984, Diane Downs was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Schoolgirls Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman were only 10 years old when they were tragically murdered in their hometown of Soham, Cambridgeshire, in 2002. The 10-year-old friends left the gathering to buy sweets in Soham, Cambridgeshire, on Sunday, August 4, 2002, but never returned. Their burnt bodies were found in a shallow grave near an airbase in Lakenheath, Suffolk, 2 weeks after they disappeared following a desperate search. Their murderer was school caretaker Ian Huntley, who went to extreme lengths to cover his tracks with the help of his girlfriend, Maxine Carr. 2 decades on, the case remains one of the saddest that Britain has ever seen, and has been revisited several times through documentaries. Maxine Carr was born Maxine Ann Capp on February 16, 1977, in Grimsby, Lincolnshire. She later changed her surname to Carr in an attempt to distance herself from her absent father. Growing up, it's reported that Carr struggled with food and her weight, and suffered from disordered eating, as well as low confidence and shyness. She received poor grades at school. However, according to interviews that former care work colleagues gave to press, she remained hopeful about one day becoming a teacher. Despite being shy when sober, it's also said that Carr often visited Grimsby nightclubs in the hopes of meeting men, and it was on one of her nights out that, in 1999, at the age of 22, she met the then 25-year-old Huntley. The pair entered a relationship and just 4 weeks after meeting, moved in together. 2 years on, when Huntley managed to secure a job as a caretaker at Soham Village College, along with a home on the grounds, Carr moved in too. It's noted that he was emotionally abusive. 1 year later, in 2002, Carr took up a support assistant job at St. Andrew's Primary School, after lying about her qualifications, and it was here that she met Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. On August 4, 2002, Wells and Chapman decided to go for a wander after having a barbecue at Wells' house. The 10-year-old best friends hadn't told anyone where they were going, but Wells' mom grew concerned when she realized they had left and not returned. On their walk, the pair came into contact with Huntley, who lured them into his cottage, later going on to kill them both. But their bodies were not immediately recovered, and police launched an intensive search involving over 400 officers as well as members of the public and the staff from a nearby U.S. Air Force base. It was 2 weeks before Wells and Chapman's bodies were found, lying side by side in a ditch 10 miles away from home. During the search for Wells and Chapman, Huntley alleged that he had encountered the girls on their walk, claiming that the pair had stopped on his doorstep to ask questions about Carr's recent application for a full-time position at their school. As one of the last people to see the girls alive, Huntley gave numerous interviews to the press, but police were suspicious of his story. During a later search of Huntley's property and the surrounding grounds, police discovered burnt items of clothing in a bin hidden in a storage hangar that matched the Manchester United tops that Wells and Chapman had both been wearing when they disappeared, prompting Huntley and Carr's arrest. When Wells and Chapman disappeared, Carr lied during the investigation by telling police that she was at home with Huntley at the time the girls vanished, although she later admitted during a police interview that she said this to fake an alibi for her boyfriend. Cracks began to appear in her cover story when she gave a TV interview in which she spoke fondly of Wells and Chapman, but referred to the girls in past tense, something she later claimed in court was due to having worked with the children in the past, In her interview with BBC Look East, Carr showed reporters a card that Wells had made for her at school. No one believes they would ever run away. They were very close to their families. This is something that I will keep for the rest of my life, Carr said. Eventually, after the girls' burnt clothes were unearthed, Carr confessed to police about her and Huntley's involvement in Wells and Chapman's murders, although he refused to answer any questions. Admitting that she had lied about her whereabouts on the day of the girls' disappearance, Carr also revealed that Huntley had told her that Wells and Chapman had come into the cottage they shared after one of the girls experienced a nosebleed, but claims she did not know he had harmed them. On August 20, 2002, Huntley was charged with 2 counts of murder, and later, after a 2-month stint in a psychiatric unit and time in high-security prisons, his high-profile trial commenced at the Old Bailey on November 5, 2003. Over a month later, on December 17, 2003, Huntley was found guilty by the jury and sentenced to 2 life terms imprisonment. Carr was also charged with 2 counts of assisting an offender after being accused of giving a false alibi and 1 count of perverting the course of justice, and took to the stand during the same trial. She is said to have told her counsel, "If, for a minute, I had known or believed he'd murdered either of those girls, I would have been horrified." Carr pleaded guilty to the charge of perverting the course of justice, but not guilty to the charge of assisting an offender. At the trial, the jury accepted her insistence that she had only lied to the police in order to protect Huntley, because, prior to their arrest, she had believed his claims of innocence. Although she was found not guilty of assisting an offender, Carr was still sentenced to 3.5 years in prison for perverting the course of justice. In total, Carr served 21 months of her initial 42-month sentence and was released on probation from Foston Hall Prison in Derbyshire on May 14, 2004. After her release from prison, Carr moved into a safe house and was granted lifelong anonymity, as well as being given a new identity. At court, her defense had argued that there was an overwhelming case for this move, and she is one of only 4 former prisoners in the UK to be protected by lifelong anonymity. The other 3 are Mary Bell, Robert Thompson, and John Venables. According to reports, Carr welcomed a son in 2011. She went on to get married in 2014 and lives in a seaside town with her partner and son. Reports state that her husband is fully aware of her past. An American kindergarten teacher, who is the mother of twins, was stabbed to death in the bathroom of an Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates shopping mall by a robed figure dubbed the Reem Island Ghost. The attack on the teacher, identified by her family as 47-year-old Ibolya Ryan, comes just weeks after the U.S. embassies in the Middle East warned citizens of an anonymous posting on a jihadist website encouraging attacks against teachers at American schools in the Middle East. In an online profile, Ryan said she was born in Romania, but trained as a teacher in the United States and worked in 4 countries over 15 years. "I wanted to experience the Arab world and experience their culture and daily life," she wrote on the teacher recruiting site. "I am working in a very traditional neighborhood, and it is very unique to learn and understand their culture." The U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi confirmed an American citizen was killed in a public restroom at a shopping mall on Reem Island and said it is working with all appropriate authorities. Abu Dhabi police released surveillance video that shows the suspect, wearing a traditional black robe, gloves, and face cover known as a niqab, coming into the mall shortly after 1 p.m. local time. The person is then seen exiting an elevator and having a quick interaction with a mall security officer before grabbing a newspaper and heading into the bathroom. According to the timestamp on the video, the suspect hustles out of the bathroom around 90 seconds later and heads straight for the elevator as bystanders scatter. At the elevator door, a female bystander apparently tries and fails to stop the suspect, who dashes into the elevator and strides out of the building. The video also contained images of a blood-stained kitchen knife and blood spattered across the bathroom floor. The injured woman was immediately rushed to Sheikh Khalifa Medical City, where she succumbed to the wounds she sustained in the attack, Abu Dhabi police said in a statement. Police said an investigation is underway into the cause of the fight and the suspect's motive, identity, and gender. Mr. Rashid Mohammed, head of Abu Dhabi's Criminal Investigation Department, said that police are now caring for the victim's twins. She had a third child who was not with her in the Emirates. Ben Glickman, the CEO of Footprints Recruiting, said Ryan was happy enough in Abu Dhabi that she had talked about extending her teaching contract or finding another position there. She was very warm, enthusiastic, he said. I know prior to moving to the UAE, she worked in special education. She worked one-on-one with a Down syndrome child in Colorado, I believe. She was a compassionate, warm, and loving person. He said that other expatriate teachers were scared by the crime, but were waiting for police to release more information on the motive. On October 29th, the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi issued a warning to U.S. citizens about the anonymous posting encouraging attacks against American teachers, but said it was unaware of any specific credible threat against any American or other school or individual in the United Arab Emirates. Nonetheless, the mission is working with local schools identified with the United States to review their security posture, it said. U.S. citizens residing in or visiting the UAE should remain vigilant regarding their personal security. In her profile for Footprints Recruiting, Ryan encouraged others to try teaching in foreign countries. She wrote, I would say be positive, open-minded, flexible, and take every challenge as a learning experience. Also be thankful that you are able to have the experience of working abroad. I think at the end it makes you not just learn about others, but also about yourself. The murderer, Aliyah Bader, 31, was found guilty of stabbing to death Ibolya Ryan, as well as creating a handmade bomb she placed in front of an Egyptian-American doctor's home, and was sentenced to death on June 29, 2015. The tragedy that would shock the whole of Australia began just before 10 p.m. on February 2, 1986. A registered nurse, 26-year-old Anita Cobby, had been having dinner with friends after finishing her shift at Sydney Hospital on Macquarie Street, next to State Parliament House in the city. She caught the 9:12 p.m. train to Blacktown in outer western Sydney to her parents' home, where she was living after recently separating from her husband. On arrival at Blacktown Station, just before 10, she went to find a phone to call her father. The usual routine was for Cobby to phone her father, Gary Lynch, to pick her up. This was well before mobile phones, and the public phone at the station had been vandalized, so Cobby decided to walk home. As she did, a Holden Kingswood slowed beside her and stopped. 2 of the 5 male occupants jumped out and grabbed her, pulling her into the car as she screamed. Cobby was then robbed, bashed, raped, and tortured before having her throat cut. So severe was the cut, it almost left her decapitated. Her bloodied, naked body was left in a secluded cow paddock at Prospect, not far from Blacktown, and was not discovered for 2 days. When Cobby's body was found, the New South Wales government posted a $50,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest. In the hope of jogging memories, a police officer dressed as Cobby traveled on the 9:12 p.m. train to Blacktown, while her colleagues interviewed passengers. Cobby's murder was front-page news. Gruesome details of the offenses and the harrowing atrocity gradually unfolded. Understandably, the community and the whole of Australia was outraged. Even the police involved in the investigation were deeply affected. Led by Detective Sergeant Ian Kennedy, a top detective of his day, it took police just under 3 weeks to track down, arrest, and charge 5 men with the murder. They were 19-year-olds John Travers and Michael Murdoch, and the Murphy brothers, 33-year-old Michael, 28-year-old Gary, and 22-year-old Leslie. The five were hated and reviled by the community. They all came from deprived backgrounds and were of below-average intelligence. They were petty criminals accused of a major crime. Given the dreadful nature of the crime, the atmosphere in the community after the arrest of Cobby's alleged killers was one of brooding malevolence. It manifested at the first formal court appearance of the five accused at the tiny Westmead Coroner's Court. Opened in 1984, Westmead Coroner's Court was brand new and located inside the grounds of the huge Westmead Hospital complex. Uniformed police were present in large numbers in case of trouble. Ominously, a dummy dangled from a noose tied to a tree branch. A large crowd had gathered. Some held up placards calling for the restoration of the death penalty. Showing solidarity with Cobby, uniformed nurses were prominent. The magistrate was the city coroner, Derek Hand. Formalities were short, and Hand promptly fixed the committal proceedings for the more secure surroundings of the coroner's court on Parramatta Road at Glebe. As the prison van edged out of the Westmead Hospital, the crowd surged forward. They banged on the sides of the van and booed and catcalled. Before the advent of the public solicitor and legal aid, the unrepresented accused standing trial was at a tremendous disadvantage. The role of counsel for the accused in any criminal trial can be controversial, particularly where there has been a grave crime. Defense counsel has a duty to act for his or her client with vigor, but also with ethical propriety. There is a popular misconception that a true defense counsel must believe in the client's innocence. Nothing can be further from the truth. A competent and vigorous defense is essential to a fair trial. The personal belief of counsel is irrelevant. The lawyer's duty is to argue, firmly, the case of their clients and not to express a personal opinion. Often, this is forgotten by the public. The so-called cab rank principle simply restates the rule that barristers do not choose their clients. If it were the other way around, despised causes and hated accused would be denied an experienced professional voice. Fearless independence for barristers is fundamental. Even more so where there is a public defender involved who holds that independent statutory office with all its privileges and its responsibilities. In seeking the convictions of the five men, the Crown relied upon the legal doctrine of common purpose. To explain common purpose, judges use an example of two would-be bank robbers. One drives the getaway car, while the other enters the bank and demands cash of the teller using a replica pistol. The teller refuses and is then shot. It turns out the pistol was not a replica. Both men are charged with murder, although the driver has never left the car. There follow disputed questions of fact and law. First of all, was there an agreement to use a replica and not a real pistol? The answer could be decisive in determining the driver's level of criminal responsibility. Likewise, did the driver know his accomplice well enough to reasonably expect him to bring a real pistol and use it? In other words, you can still be guilty of murder if you have never set eyes on the victim, let alone wanted them to be killed. The defense of each of the accused in the Anita Cobby case was that Travers alone had the knife. Travers alone stabbed Cobby. He alone was to blame for her death. The Crown case was, irrespective of what each actually did that night, all were equally responsible for her death, and each was guilty of murder. Because each knew what Travers was likely to do, therefore all were equally guilty. For the Crown, this was true as a matter of law, and, equally compellingly, as a matter of fact and common sense. Even so, questions remained as to the extent of each accused's personal involvement. In that respect, their signed confessions were the Crown's trump cards. The defense claimed the confessions were obtained improperly and by force. To present the client's case, those allegations had to be put. They were all denied by the police. The line of defense that emerged was, even accepting the Crown case, the worst that could be sheeted home to Murdoch and the murder fees for the death, in terms of legal liability, was the crime of manslaughter. That line of reasoning was barely intellectually respectable, but, nonetheless, required a competent presentation to the jury. Was only Travers accountable for murder, and one or more of the remaining 4 only guilty of manslaughter? On March 16, 1987, when the trial began in historic No. 5 Court at Darlinghurst, the Central Criminal Court, the bar table was crowded with 5, sometimes 6, robed barristers and their instructing solicitors for what the press soon described as the trial of the century. The usually solemn atmosphere at Darlinghurst was absent the morning the trial began. A huge number of potential jurors milled around in front of the sandstone pillars, spilling over onto the lawns fronting Taylor Square and Oxford Street. Television crews seemed everywhere, as were radio network reporters. The press had their usual reserved prime seats on the judge's left, facing the jury. This trial clearly raised the question, does the community want symbolic or real representation for major criminals? Under our system, the accused is not guilty until our grand, but still imperfect, system has run its full course. The spectacular miscarriages of justice, staining our history, highlights the still inherent dangers which arise through human fallibility. A major safeguard is that all court proceedings, with the rarest of exceptions, are open to the public, and, perhaps more importantly, open to and subject to intense scrutiny by the media. There was certainly no absence of that for this trial. In such a case, where there is justifiable community anger, counsel has at least 2 options. One can merely go through the motions to ensure it appears the formalities of a fair trial were observed. Alternatively, counsel does what he or she should do in every case. That is, to do one's professional best for a client who would not have a clue what that involves. Opening the Crown case to the jury, Alan Saunders QC lived up to his reputation, describing in detail the callousness Anita Cobby suffered. He described Cobby's ordeal as sustained degradation, brutal, unbridled lust, culminating in one of the most savage, brutal murders the state has ever known. Any wonder the media called it the trial of the century. The first witness set an atmosphere of indescribable sadness. Cobby's father, Gary Lynch. He was a tall, dignified figure. He gave brief, formal identification evidence relating to his late daughter. While he did so, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. He then joined his wife at the back of the court, where they remained for the duration of the trial. Gary and Grace Lynch attended the trial each day. They showed great dignity. Because of police fears, security was tight and gallery, and lawyers alike were searched after each adjournment. In the process, Cobby's parents often had to stand in a line with their daughter's killer's lawyers. Never once did they show anything other than class. Propriety and protocol prevented them from exchanging a single word. There were no eyewitnesses to Cobby's ordeal, and the principal evidence was the individual confessions. It must be said, the account of one and the other's confessions could not legally be used against another. This means the confession can be used to prove the guilt of its author, but not prove guilt against any co-accused mentioned in it. This is a safe and fair way to view confessions, because the confessor may want to shift the blame to their co-accused. It should be for a jury hearing evidence to determine the accountability of each accused. The exception to this rule is where the co-accused agrees with another's confession. To get offenders to agree with each other's confessions, even in part, thereby implicating themselves. While not unlawful, the strategy is discouraged. Accepting the confessor's account only against the person making it is a technical but important rule. The Crown had the powerful advantage of not having to ask the jury to rely on circumstantial evidence alone, but on the words out of each accused's own mouth. At the outset, sadly, there could be no argument about the fact poor Anita Cobby had been murdered. The trial was all about, number 1, the involvement of all or any of the accused, number 2, if that issue were resolved adversely, the extent of involvement, and number 3, having decided the extent of legal liability, whether the particular accused is guilty of murder or manslaughter. In part, Michael Murphy's case, and that of his 2 brothers and Michael Murdoch, was that Travers inflicted the fatal wounds on Cobby with a knife and was acting on his own account. Travers had pleaded guilty to this. So far as the murder charge was concerned, there was really no direct evidence to support a conviction of the others for murder on the basis they assisted or encouraged Travers to commit murder. Michael Murphy allegedly told the police, "I didn't want her to be killed. Travers is a lunatic. It's his fault. I told him not to kill her." In legal terms, it was the defendant's case that they were neither party to a common purpose to commit murder, nor had they intentionally assisted or encouraged Travers to commit the murder. That was not technical legalistic jargon. It was fundamental. It must be conceded on the Crown case there was evidence they, as Travers' co-offenders, were criminally liable either as principals or accessories for the murder, as well as the other grave crimes alleged. They denied this. Defense strategy in this trial was to avoid confronting and emphasizing prejudicial evidence, and to direct the focus to more favorable features. But the harsh reality of the situation was such favorable facts were thin on the ground. Michael Murphy's defense was a legal nightmare. On his instructions, he was not guilty of any crime. The law provides being present when a crime is committed is not an offense. But to infer that co-accused John Travers, who pleaded guilty, committed the murder of his own volition. The reading of the accused's statements was damaging stuff, but nothing compared with the police photographs of the scene and the post-mortem details. Again, what was the client's defense? "I wasn't there, and if I was, it was for sex and not for murder." Merely stating those horrible alternatives underlines the gargantuan task facing the defense. Given the basis of the Travers as a maniac defense, this unanswerable question always loomed large. Why, then, ever be in his company? The jury deliberated all day and were locked up in a secret location overnight to continue their deliberations. They were obviously conscientious, and, from time to time, sought Justice Maxwell's help. All communications were proper and in open court in the presence of the accused. The morning for the sentencing had arrived. At 10 a.m. there was a slight delay, as Anita Cobby's parents were not in court. When they arrived, all that remained was the formal ritual of judgment. Everyone in court thought they knew the result: life. Even so, there still was the possibility that release one day would not be excluded. The judge entered and was seated. Then the 5 accused, together for the first time since the first day of the trial, were brought up into the dock. There were police everywhere. The atmosphere in the courtroom was one of unprecedented tension. So high was the emotion, at one stage, the experienced, calm, and respected judge, Maxwell, was moved to tears. The press recorded him stopping with tears in his eyes and drinking a glass of water before resuming his remarks. Defense counsel had faced a hopeless task in securing a calm, detached hearing from the jury, but they had never seen a judge so upset before. When Maxwell formally passed the sentences, penal servitude for life, the dignity of the Central Criminal Court gave way to wild scenes, and uniformed sheriffs struggled perfunctorily to restore order. The court had momentarily descended into unseemly uproar. In addition, Maxwell specified and passed upon each of the 5 the following sentences: kidnapping, 16 years, robbery with wounding, 17 years, maliciously inflict bodily harm with intent to have sexual intercourse, 12 years, and theft of a motor vehicle, 5 years. To put it bluntly, the long concurrent sentences imposed were purely academic gestures. Maxwell concluded with these words: "The circumstances of these prisoners and the circumstances of the murder of Anita Lorraine Cobby prompt me to recommend that the official files of each prisoner should be clearly marked never to be released. 21-year-old Hannah Cornelius and Cheslin Marsh, 22, were the best of friends. Students at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, the fun-loving pair would often spend their downtime together, going to dance clubs to unwind after a long week of studying. Hannah was born on February 6, 1996 in Cape Town, South Africa, and she went to college in the next town over for language. Her parents wanted her to go to school to study law like them, but understood she would have to follow her path in life. On Saturday, May 27, 2017, they had stayed out painting the town until well after midnight. Although Cheslin had planned on skateboarding back to his flat, Hannah wouldn't hear of it. Knowing how dangerous the streets could be at such a late hour, she insisted on driving him home in her Volkswagen City Golf, a gift from her grandmother. When they pulled into the parking lot in front of Cheslin's apartment, their movements were captured on the building's security cameras. As they sat in the vehicle saying goodnight, 4 men could be seen walking in and out of frame. Moments later, the group reappears, only this time, they make their way over to Hannah's car, where they proceed to surround it on all sides. Even though it was chilly out, the driver's side window was partially rolled down, giving one of the men just enough room to thrust a screwdriver in Hannah's face. Realizing in an instant that they were in trouble, Cheslin had made a grab for the makeshift weapon. As he did so, another of the men climbed into the back of the car and threatened the couple with a knife. All hell broke loose at that point as the 4 assailants robbed the couple at knife point. As Hannah begged them to take what they wanted and leave, one of the men took off with the goods while the others forced Cheslin into the trunk, leaving the 3 remaining culprits alone with Hannah. Mr. Marsh was robbed of cash and his phone, and before being locked in the car trunk, and then the 4 men drove to a drug dealer's home to buy drugs and smoked crystal meth. As they drove off into the night, the men assured their terrified captive that they only wanted the car and would drop her and her friend off as soon as the opportunity arose. Magistrate's daughter Hannah was wedged between 2 of the 4 men in the back seat of the Golf, which her grandmother had given to her as a birthday present. They then drove out of the upmarket wine-producing town of Stellenbosch near Cape Town in Hannah's car, and it later pulled over and they took Mr. Marsh into the bushes. 3 men made him lay his head on a rock on the ground and then battered his skull with house bricks until they thought he was dead, then left his blood-soaked body. That afternoon, Marsh recovered consciousness and staggered to a nearby home suffering severe head injuries and a broken arm to raise the alarm about Hannah. Unknown to him, her body had been found earlier, several miles away, dumped by the roadside, and a huge police search was already underway for him and the gang. She had been dragged into bushes at a vineyard and gang raped by 3 of the men, and then her skull was crushed with a large rock and she was stabbed in the neck. Mr. Marsh said when they pulled up, the gang pounced, threatening to stab Hannah to death with a sharpened screwdriver and him to death with a knife placed at his back. He described how they were driven to a suburb of Cape Town called Kraaifontein, 11 miles from where they were hijacked in Stellenbosch, and he was pulled from the car trunk. Mr. Marsh was so traumatized he never returned to his studies and is now deaf in one ear as a result of his injuries, and vivid scars could be seen on his head as he gave evidence. One of the men accused of the murder of Hannah had his confession made the day after his arrest read to the court and said the gang went into town to see what they could get. Whitboy alleged the other 3 took Mr. Marsh out the boot while he had a smoke and into the bushes and said they told him they had tied him up and left him to be found. He said he was only after money and said after Mr. Marsh was left for dead, the gang drove off and later took Hannah into bushes, but denied any part in her rape and murder. Whitboy said that 3 others returned from the bushes after raping Hannah and said, "While we were driving, Parsons said I had missed out on having had sex with her." He said they had tied the girl up and that the workers would find her tomorrow. The gang, then high on drugs, went on a robbery spree in the hijacked car, robbing at least 3 women before the stolen car was spotted, and a high-speed police chase began. 3 were arrested after dumping the car and fleeing, and the 4th was arrested later. Sadly, throughout the court process, those men showed no remorse for their actions. They even smiled and laughed throughout their trial, showing zero regard or remorse for their victims or her families. Their actions were met with widespread condemnation, and the community stood firmly in support of the victims' families. In November 2018, the 4 men were sentenced to life in prison, providing some closure to a family and community in mourning. If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.